The howling wind outside the observation station was a constant companion to Kalen's solitude. Most days, he barely noticed it anymore. Just another voice in the emptiness of Iridia Prime, a frozen wasteland at the edge of colonized space. Today, however, the magnetic storms were particularly fierce, battering the reinforced walls of his self-imposed prison with renewed fury. Kale, as he preferred to be called, moved mechanically through his daily routine. Check the life support systems, calibrate the atmospheric sensors, record the data, repeat. The monotony was intentional, a penance for failures he couldn't forgive himself for. 3 years had passed since the Callisto mission, since he'd watched his team die while he survived. 3 years of exile on this forgotten outpost, maintaining weather monitoring equipment that hardly anyone consulted anymore. The station's emergency alert startled him from his thoughts. A proximity sensor had activated on the perimeter. Kale frowned, checking the readings with skepticism. The storms often triggered false alarms, electromagnetic interference playing havoc with the aging equipment. But this was different. There was a biological signature, faint and fluctuating, but unmistakably alive. Probably just local wildlife, he muttered to himself, trying to ignore the alert. The native creatures of Iridia Prime were hardy and occasionally curious about the human structure in their midst. Yet something about the signature seemed wrong. The readout showed distress indicators, pain responses, elevated hormones, a weakening life pattern. Whatever was out, there was suffering. Kale stared at the screen for several long minutes, debating with himself. He'd chosen isolation for a reason. Involvement meant responsibility, and he'd proven himself catastrophically unworthy of that burden. But the thought of something dying just beyond his walls, something he might have saved, was too reminiscent of his nightmares. "Damn all," he growled, moving to the equipment locker. The thermal suit was necessary for even brief excursions onto the planet's surface, where temperatures regularly dropped to levels that could freeze human flesh solid in minutes. He checked the oxygen levels, secured the seals, and grabbed a portable scanner and emergency medical kit. The airlock cycled with a wheezing groan, and Kale stepped out into the storm. The wind hit him like a physical blow, visibility reduced to just a few meters through the swirling ice crystals. He activated the scanner, using it to guide him toward the biological signature. 20 meters northwest of the station entrance, he almost stumbled over the form half buried in the snow. At first glance, she appeared human, a woman, unconscious and clearly in distress. But as Kale kneeled beside her, his light illuminated subtle differences. Her skin had a faint bluish undertone beneath the unhealthy purple of extreme cold exposure. Her features were angular in ways that seemed beautiful but decidedly non-human. Fine, almost invisible patterns traced across her exposed skin like natural markings. Her clothing was completely inadequate for Viridia's climate, thin, tattered garments that might have been some kind of uniform or utilitarian outfit, now ripped and soiled. More disturbing were the marks on her visible skin. Fresh bruises overlaid old scars, systematic patterns that spoke of deliberate mistreatment rather than accident. Most concerning was a metallic band around her wrist, inscribed with symbols Kale didn't recognize. It looked technological, not decorative, with no visible clasp or opening mechanism. Kale's medical scanner confirmed what was visually obvious: extreme hypothermia, exhaustion, malnourishment, and various injuries, both recent and older. Without intervention, she would die within minutes. As he carefully lifted her, her eyes fluttered open briefly. They were striking, irises of deep violet with flecks of silver, clouded now with pain, and something else Kale recognized immediately: absolute terror. She recoiled from his touch despite her weakness, her body tensing in anticipation of harm. Then, in a voice barely audible over the wind, she spoke in halting, accented English. "Please, make me your personal slave, human. Don't hurt me." The words were choked with shame and fear before she lapsed back into unconsciousness. Kale froze, the statement hitting him like a physical blow. What horrors had she experienced to make such a plea? Whatever her story, He couldn't leave her to die. He lifted her as gently as possible and carried her back toward the station, the storm closing in around them like a shroud. Inside the station's medical bay, little more than an alcove with basic equipment, Cale worked methodically to address the woman's immediate physical needs. The thermal blankets and heating pads would slowly raise her core temperature. The scanner guided his treatment of frostbite on her. Extremities. Intravenous fluids would help with dehydration. The metal band around her wrist presented a challenge. Up close, it appeared to be some kind of monitoring or control device, but it was currently inactive. After careful examination, Cale found a nearly invisible seam and managed to remove it without damaging it, setting it aside for later investigation. Throughout his ministrations, the woman flinched and trembled even in her unconscious state. Every time his hands approached her, her breathing quickened in fear. When she drifted toward consciousness, she would whimper and try to curl into herself protectively before falling back into exhausted sleep. For 3 days, this pattern continued. Cale kept his distance as much as possible while ensuring her medical needs were met. He arranged food and water where she could reach them if she woke while he was away. He spoke softly, explaining what he was doing before any necessary contact, and moved with deliberate slowness to avoid startling her. On the 4th day, she finally fully regained consciousness. Cale entered the medical alcove to find her pressed against the wall, watching him with wary, frightened eyes. She was alert but terrified, tracking his every movement like prey watching a predator. "My name is Kalen," he said softly, keeping his distance. "You're safe here. This is a weather observation station on Viridia Prime. I found you outside, nearly frozen. Do you understand me?" She gave a tiny nod, but said nothing. When he offered food, she wouldn't take it until he stepped all the way across the room and turned his back. He could hear the sounds of desperate, hurried eating, as if she expected the food to be taken away at any moment. Days passed in this tense silence. Cale observed her when she thought he wasn't looking. The way she systematically examined her surroundings, the precise way she moved despite her injuries, how she startled at certain mechanical sounds but displayed remarkable calm during the violent storms outside. She was traumatized but intelligent, analyzing her situation even through her fear. Her scars told a story too. Some were surgical in nature, others clearly punitive. There were marks around her wrists and ankles consistent with restraints used long-term. But there were older marks too, suggesting she hadn't always been a captive, small scars that might have been childhood accidents, a healed fracture that had been properly treated. Cale found himself modifying his behavior to accommodate her trauma. He announced his presence before entering rooms, kept his movements predictable, and explained systems in the station out loud, not directly to her, but within her hearing. He left datapad with information about Viridia Prime, where she could access them privately. One evening, a tool slipped from Cale's hand, clattering loudly on the metal floor. He turned to see the woman frozen in place, eyes squeezed shut, body trembling. But she hadn't run or begged for mercy as she might have days earlier. She was still terrified, but something had shifted. Perhaps she was simply too exhausted to maintain that level of fear, or perhaps some small trust had begun to form. That night, Cale lay awake contemplating her presence. His isolation had been a choice, her trauma had not. In helping her, he was forced to interact, to be present in a way he'd avoided for years. It was uncomfortable, but somehow necessary, like setting a broken bone. A week after finding her, disaster struck. The main heating system, already strained by the unusually intense magnetic storms, failed catastrophically. The temperature inside the station began dropping rapidly. Emergency backup systems activated, but couldn't compensate fully. Cale rushed to the maintenance access panel, pulling out diagnostic tools. The main power coupling had been damaged by power surges from the storms, and replacing it would require navigating through a narrow maintenance shaft. As he struggled with the repair, he felt rather than saw someone approach. The woman stood a careful distance away, watching intently. When he dropped a crucial connector in the awkward space, she moved forward hesitantly, retrieving it with slender fingers. She held it out to him, not quite meeting his eyes, but clearly offering help. For hours they worked together in near silence. She anticipated his needs with surprising accuracy, handing him tools before he asked or pointing to problems he'd overlooked. Her technical understanding was evident in the few words or gestures she offered. Clearly, her background included engineering expertise. When the system finally hummed back to life, warmth gradually returning to the station, they both sat exhausted on the floor, a careful distance still between them. "Thank you," Kale said simply. She nodded, then spoke her first voluntary words since arrival. "Temperature regulation is important on a winter planet." Her voice was soft but clear with a melodic quality to her accent. The silence that followed was different than before, not filled with fear, but with the mutual recognition of cooperation. Trying to maintain this fragile connection, Kale spoke about the station's systems, explaining how they were designed to function in Viridia's harsh environment. As they sat in the gradually warming common area, Kale found himself mentioning his previous work designing environmental systems for deep space missions. Nothing about the Callisto disaster, just innocent memories of technical challenges and creative solutions. "I used to love solving impossible problems," he admitted, "finding ways to create habitable spaces where none should exist." She listened attentively, and when he finished, she offered softly, "My name is Lyra." It was a small disclosure, but enormously significant. Kale nodded, careful not to make too much of the moment. "It's good to meet you, Lyra." The next day, while searching for replacement parts, Kale discovered an old holographic projector in storage. It was a standard-issue relaxation device for isolated outposts, designed to combat the psychological effects of confinement. When activated, it displayed a realistic simulation of Earth's night sky. That evening, he set it up in the common area, but didn't activate it immediately. When Lyra cautiously entered the room, he explained what it was, then stepped away to give her space. He switched it on remotely, filling the ceiling with stars. Lyra's reaction was profound. She stood absolutely still, face upturned to the projection, eyes wide. A subtle tremor ran through her body, and tears formed in her eyes, though she made no sound. "You can adjust it," Kale said from across the room. "The control panel can show different star systems." After a long moment, Lyra approached the device. Her fingers moved over the controls with growing confidence. The star field shifted, constellations rearranging into unfamiliar patterns. She stopped on a particular configuration, her expression a complex mixture of longing and sorrow. "Home?" Kale asked softly. She didn't answer directly, but her hand hovered over the projection as if trying to touch something forever out of reach. For the first time, she looked at Kale not with fear, but with something approaching curiosity, as if reassessing who he might be. 2 weeks after Lyra's arrival, as they settled into a cautious routine of coexistence, the station's long-range communication system activated unexpectedly. A weak, encrypted signal was being received, originating from somewhere in Viridia Prime's orbit. Kale's blood ran cold when he analyzed the transmission frequency. It matched patterns embedded in the metallic band he'd removed from Lyra's wrist. Someone was searching for something, or someone. When he showed Lyra the signal data, her reaction was immediate and visceral. She backed away from the display, eyes wide with renewed terror, breathing accelerating toward hyperventilation. But mixed with the fear was something new, anger, a flash of defiance quickly buried under panic. "They're coming for me," she whispered. "They always come." "Who are they, Lyra?" Kale asked gently. "I can't help if I don't understand." The story emerged haltingly, with long pauses and moments where Lyra seemed to retreat into herself before continuing. She belonged to a species called the Elysian, from a system several sectors away. Her people were known for their natural aptitude with complex systems and technology, their neural structure allowing intuitive understanding of patterns humans often found challenging. She had been a researcher, part of a collaborative scientific mission with several other species. But their ship had been attacked by raiders, a particular faction that specialized in capturing and selling assets to the highest bidder. They don't just want slaves, she explained, her voice hollow. They want tools, specialized equipment that can think and solve problems. She unconsciously touched her scars. They modify their acquisitions for optimal performance and compliance. The wristband was a control device, part tracker, part behavioral modification tool. It could deliver pain or pleasure directly to the nervous system, reinforcing desired behaviors and punishing resistance. More insidiously, it contained dormant nanotechnology that could be activated remotely, designed to interface with implants already in her body. If they activate the full protocol, Lyra shuddered. I won't be myself anymore. Just a willing, eager tool designed to please its owner. Her escape had been pure chance, a power fluctuation during a magnetic storm while the ship passed near Viridia Prime. The storm had damaged her control band, giving her a brief window to flee in an emergency pod. She'd aimed for the faint signal of the observation station, the only sign of civilization on the frozen planet. And now they've found me, she concluded, wrapping her arms around herself. Kale faced an impossible decision. The station wasn't designed for defense, and its communication equipment couldn't reach any colonial authority that might help. They could try to hide, but the Raiders' technology likely far exceeded the station's stealth capabilities. They could attempt to escape using the station's small maintenance shuttle, but it wasn't designed for long-range travel, and they had nowhere to go. Looking at Lyra's face, at the person emerging from behind the mask of terror, Kale knew he couldn't surrender her to a fate worse than death. Something long dormant stirred in him, a sense of purpose he thought had died with his team on Callisto. They won't take you, he said simply. We'll find a way. Over the next 2 days, they prepared. Using his military background and Lyra's technical knowledge, they transformed the weather station into a defensive position. They couldn't match the Raiders' firepower, but they knew the terrain and had the advantage of desperation. The plan they devised was risky. They would use the disabled control band as bait, placing it in one of the ice caves near the station, rigged with sensors. When the Raiders investigated, Kale and Lyra would use the station's maintenance shuttle to escape to the planet's magnetic North Pole, where the intense field disturbances would mask their presence. On the third day, their sensors detected a small craft entering the atmosphere. Lyra's face went pale, but her hands remained steady as she finished the final preparations. Kalen, she said softly, using his full name for the first time. If this doesn't work, if they catch me. She swallowed hard. Promise you won't let them take me alive. Kale looked into her eyes, no longer filled with the blank terror of their first meeting, but with the clear resolve of someone who knew exactly what she was asking. He nodded once, understanding the mercy in what would be an unforgivable act. The approach of the Raiders' craft was methodical, scanning patterns suggesting advanced technology, seeking specific signatures. When they detected the control band's signal in the ice caves, the craft changed course as predicted. Kale and Lyra moved swiftly to the maintenance shuttle, initiating launch procedures. But as they prepared to depart, the station's systems suddenly failed, all power cutting simultaneously. A focused electromagnetic pulse, targeted with precision. They've been in orbit longer than we thought, Lyra whispered, fear and resignation mingling in her voice. They were prepared for tricks. The shuttle was useless without power. They were trapped. Kale's military instincts kicked in. There's still the emergency generator in the lower level. It's shielded against EMPs. If we can reach it. They made their way through the darkened station, guided by Kale's knowledge of the layout and Lyra's surprising ability to see in low light. They had nearly reached the emergency access when the main airlock cycled open. They froze, listening to the methodical footsteps of multiple intruders entering the station. Standardized search pattern, professional movements. These weren't common bandits, but trained hunters. Reaching the emergency generator, they managed to activate it, bringing minimal systems back online in the lower level only. Lyra worked feverishly at a terminal, attempting to reroute power to essential systems without alerting the intruders to their location. I need more time, she whispered urgently. I'll give you time, Kale replied, checking the charge on his mining laser. a tool never designed as a weapon, but their only defense. What followed was a desperate game of cat and mouse through the station's narrow corridors and maintenance shafts. Cale used every trick from his military days, setting diversions and false trails to keep the hunters away from Lyra's position. He caught glimpses of their pursuers, humanoid figures in advanced tactical gear, methodical and eerily silent in their search. Meanwhile, Lyra executed her desperate plan. Using the station's systems in ways they were never intended, she created a feedback loop in the communication array. If successful, it would generate a massive electromagnetic surge, enough to disable any technology within the station, including the hunter's equipment and, crucially, her own implants. The risk was enormous. The surge might stop her heart, given the extent of her modifications. But the alternative was unthinkable. As the hunters closed in on her position, Lyra activated the surge. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every electronic system in the station overloaded simultaneously. The hunters' equipment failed, their communications filling with static. But most dramatically, Lyra collapsed in agony, her body convulsing as the implants within her short-circuited. Cale fought his way to her side, dispatching a disoriented hunter with a desperate blow. He found Lyra unconscious, blood trickling from her nose and ears, her pulse faint and irregular. With no medical equipment functioning, he could only hold her, whispering desperate encouragements as he dragged her toward the emergency supplies cache. Outside, the magnetic storm had intensified, perhaps influenced by the massive energy discharge from the station. It would temporarily prevent the hunter's ship from approaching or providing support. A small advantage, but perhaps enough. Using basic medical supplies and sheer determination, Cale stabilized Lyra's condition. As the emergency generator gradually restored minimal power to essential systems, he established a defensive position around the medical bay, prepared for the hunter's inevitable assault. But when Lyra finally regained consciousness, something had changed. Her eyes held a clarity that hadn't been there before, and she touched her temples in wonder. "I can't hear them," she whispered. "The voices, the commands, they're gone." The surge had permanently disabled the control implants. For the first time in years, her mind was fully her own. With this realization came not just relief but rage, cold, focused, and deadly. "I know how they think," she said, her voice stronger. "I know how they operate, and I know how to defeat them." What followed was a reversal of the hunt. Using Lyra's intimate knowledge of her captor's tactics and Cale's military experience, they systematically isolated and neutralized the hunting party. Lyra knew exactly how to exploit weaknesses in their equipment, and Cale executed the ambushes with precision. The final confrontation came in the station's main control room. The leader of the hunters, his tactical advantages neutralized, resorted to raw brutality. He was physically imposing, enhanced with cybernetic augmentations that the EMP hadn't fully disabled. As he and Cale fought in desperate close-quarters combat, Lyra accessed the environmental controls. With precise timing, she vented superheated steam from a ruptured conduit, catching the hunter in a blast that no augmentation could withstand. In the aftermath, they secured the unconscious survivors in the station's storage compartment, converted into a makeshift brig. Using components from the hunter's own equipment, they repaired the communication array enough to send a distress signal to the Colonial Authority, masking it as a routine emergency from the hunter's own ship. For 3 days, they waited in exhausted vigilance, uncertain if their signal had been received or if more hunters would arrive. The storm eventually subsided, leaving an eerie calm over the frozen landscape. On the 4th day, as they shared a meager meal in the partially repaired common area, Lyra spoke of her home for the first time, not just the facts of her capture, but memories of her life before. She described crystal cities built into mountain ranges, research facilities nestled in forests where scientists could study natural systems up close, and her own work developing sustainable infrastructure for developing worlds. "I never thought I would speak of these things again," she admitted quietly. "When they first took me, I tried to remember who I was. Each night, I would recite my accomplishments, my memories, my beliefs. But over time, it became too painful to remember what was lost. It was easier to become what they wanted. Kale, in turn, finally spoke of Callisto, of the mission that went catastrophically wrong, the miscalculation in his environmental system design that led to a cascade failure, of watching his team die while he survived in a pocket of breathable air created by pure chance. I came here to disappear, he confessed, to be as irrelevant to the universe as possible. I thought that was the only penance that made sense. Lyra regarded him thoughtfully. And now I'm not sure, he admitted. Helping you. It didn't balance the scales. Nothing could, but it felt like living again instead of just existing. A week after the battle, a Colonial Authority patrol ship responded to their signal. The hunters were taken into custody, their ship impounded as evidence of illicit human trafficking and prohibited technology use. Lyra's testimony would be crucial in prosecuting not just these individuals, but potentially the entire operation they represented. The authority officer offered them immediate evacuation from Viridia Prime. The station had sustained significant damage and was deemed unsafe for long-term habitation. They had perhaps 2 weeks before systems failed completely. After the officers departed, promising to return with a proper transport vessel, Kale and Lyra stood at the observation window, watching Viridia's weak sun rising over the ice plains. "Where will you go?" Kale asked finally, the question that had hung between them unspoken. Lyra was silent for a long moment. "I don't know if my home exists anymore, at least not as I knew it. After what was done to me." She touched the faint scars where her implants had been removed. "I'm not the person I was." "Neither am I," Kale said softly. Their hands found each other, fingers intertwining cautiously. It wasn't romantic. Not yet, but something equally profound. The touch of 2 people who had seen each other at their most vulnerable and remained. "We have 2 weeks, Lyra said, a hint of her newfound strength in her voice. "That's enough time to decide what comes next." Kale nodded, feeling something unfamiliar and fragile blooming in his chest. Not happiness exactly, but possibility, the sense that the future held more than mere survival. In the days that followed, they worked together to maintain the failing station, sharing meals and quiet conversations about what might come after Viridia Prime. Sometimes they would activate the star projector, lying on the floor watching constellations from a dozen worlds scroll across the ceiling. Lyra no longer flinched at unexpected movements or sounds. Kale found himself speaking of plans and possibilities rather than just enduring each day. The station, once his prison and then briefly their battleground, had become something else entirely. A crucible where 2 broken people had begun to forge something new from the fragments of their former selves. One night, as they watched the aurora dancing above the ice fields, Lyra turned to Kale with solemn eyes. "When we first met," she said carefully, "I asked you to make me your slave. It was the only way I knew how to survive." She held his gaze steadily. "I want you to know that I choose to stay with you now, as your equal, as your friend. Whatever comes next, it will be my choice." Kale nodded, understanding the importance of what she was reclaiming. "And I choose to go forward, not back. Whatever we build from here will be new for both of us." They turned back to the window, shoulders touching lightly, watching the colors ripple across the sky, a natural phenomenon neither had truly appreciated before. The station's systems hummed and occasionally sputtered around them, the temperature regulations still imperfect, the future uncertain. But for the first time in years, the silence between them was not the silence of fear or shame or regret, but the comfortable quiet of 2 people who had found in each other not salvation exactly, but the courage to begin again. Outside, the endless winter of Viridia Prime continued, indifferent to the small human dramas played out within its domain. But within the walls of the failing station, something had thawed that no cold could touch again.